Good evening. It's time to go ahead and get started. We do want to make mention of a few announcements tonight as we begin. First off, on our prayer list, we want to continue to remember Colin Cothrell. He broke his ankle in a sledding accident, so make sure that you continue to remember him. Rod Priester has been diagnosed with a colon cancer, and he will meet with the surgeon on the 31st, so make sure that you pray for him and those upcoming requests that he's going to have. Carl Harper is back in the NHC recovering from pneumonia, and they've requested no visitors at this time, and I saw David. Is he still there? So make sure that you continue to remember Mr. Carl at this time. And then Mr. Bob Lee is recovering at home, so that's always good to hear a positive note about as well. A couple of announcements that we want to make mention of. Our deepest sympathy is extended to the family of Sophia Birdwell on the passing of her uncle Jim Pazarekis on Tuesday, January 16th in Maine. I know that she flew out for the funeral, so make sure that you keep her and her family in your prayers, and maybe even keep Adam in your prayers as he's wrangling the boys while she's gone. I know he would appreciate that. Do want to make mention that there is a widow and widower's lunch that will be held on Thursday, January 25th at Granite City, and they will be meeting at the restaurant at 11:15 a.m. There's a sign-up sheet across from the church office on this hallway back here to my right and to your left. And if you are interested in going, you can text or call Miss Linda Marvin and let her know. There will be a ladies' tea party and luncheon at the home of Nino Strong on Tuesday, January 30th at 12 p.m. If you would, RSVP to Miss Nino, and this is to honor our sweet, dear Miss Juanita Gregory. So make sure that you bring a box of your favorite tea. For those who normally attend Dan's class on Wednesday night, I was told to make mention Dan won't be here tonight, so his class will not be meeting tonight. So make sure that you find another class to be a part of. Leading us this evening, our song leader will be Brother Matthew Cullum. I'll have our devotional thought here in just a moment, and then our brother Chad Stevens will close us out in prayer. That's all the announcements that I have. At this time, we'll join in song. I just want to mention for just a moment, if you're like me, and chances are there's many of you who have felt this way in the last week or two, anytime that we go through situations in life where we are isolated away from people, I really, truly struggle in those moments because I feed off of the energy of being around other people. Even more important than that, I absolutely adore and love spending time with the Lord's church and the Lord's people. And I know many of you do as well. And when situations like this past week happen, there's almost this gut-wrenching panic that initially goes through my mind. Wait, I'm not going to be able to see so-and-so this week, or I'm not going to have to wrestle Lucy to be quiet this week. And there's all these different things that go through my head, but at the end of the day, a lot of the conversations that go on in my head come from the struggle of missing the Lord's people. For me, growing up, my childhood was not the ideal childhood, and I spent the majority of my free time not around family, not around moms and dad, not around grandparents or aunts and uncles. The majority of my time was spent around folks from the church that I grew up in. And so when times come where I lose that precious moments, those precious moments of time of being around people, it's in those moments that I really, truly do struggle. As I've gotten older and life has continued to go the way that life can sometimes, and hardships have come and gone, and great times have come and gone, I've continued to grow a deeper appreciation just a little bit more each day for the Lord's church. Whether that's in the times where we're in the darkest moments and I need help to surround me and help me to overcome things, or whether it's in those moments of extreme joy where I get to celebrate things like having Lucy, or things like having a reunion of being in ministry for so long. There's so many moments that have become so precious to me, and as I've gotten older, what I've come to realize more and more is that those moments seem to always be around the Lord's church. And to a lot of people in the world, unfortunately, they don't have the blessing or the privilege of being a part of the Lord's church like I do. And I've questioned this over and over in my head, and I've even made this comment to people before. I don't see how anyone can go through this world and go through this life without the Lord's church. And as I think about all of that, and I kind of wrestle with this thought of how important the church is to me and how important God's family is to me, I also think about things like, well, what about situations that aren't always the easiest? Because the reality is, if you spend enough time around people, you start to learn people's flaws. You start to realize that there are people who maybe don't think exactly like you in the same church that we worship together in the same services, in the same place. And there are moments of tension where there's struggle and there's conflict, and we have to figure out how to work through those. And after thinking about even the difficult situations that you go through around the Lord's church, and if you're like me, maybe you've come to the conclusion that I have, is that even in the midst of difficult situations and conflict and struggle and trial that I have endured and kind of went through, and maybe even caused as a part of the church, there's still nothing better on this side of heaven than being part of the Lord's people. It's a central part of my life. And so when times like COVID, or times like when we have an ice storm where we can't be together, come into my life, I really struggle with those moments of being away, of being isolated. And Ashley, even, she'll give you a rundown of me that when snow and ice and all those things happen, I'm the first one that's trying to figure out how can I leave the house to go see somebody. Because it's central and it's important to my life. And as I think about that, it comes back to this one thought that I have been reminded of over and over through the text, and it comes from John chapter 13. And it's this moment in which Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, the most powerful individual who's ever stepped 2 feet physically on this planet, gets down and he washes his disciples' feet. And when he gets down, and you go down in chapter 13 of John and you begin in verse 12 and you look, it says, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for I am so." In verse 14 he says, If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. And as I read through passages like this, what I quickly come to see is that Jesus truly did care for his people. He truly loved the church. As you read through the New Testament, you read other passages that stress how much he loved the church, that he was willing to die for them and to lay down his life, that he was willing to take on the sins that we commit just so that we could be a part of this group. And then over and over we're reminded that Jesus did all of those things. He washed feet. He went to the cross. He dealt with the persecution. He dealt with the incredible temptation that he dealt with face to face with Satan. He went through all of those things so that we can even be a part of what's called the church. And the New Testament stresses to us that's the example we try to follow. And so as we look at his example and we see just how much he loved the church and how much he was willing to serve the church, there's this expectation that Christians or children of God or daughters of the King or whatever phrase you want to throw out to deal with your views of being a child of God may be, the reality is this: we have to grow and develop this deep appreciation for the church, just as he did. A scary trend that has been happening for a few years, I would say 10 years or more, maybe even 15 years that I've been experiencing is there's been so many conversations that I've had with individuals who have talked about their commitment to God and talked about how they're Christians and talked about how much they love God and how much they want to serve God, but then they have this extremely skewed taste of the church. And they push this thought that they want to be a Christian but don't want to be a part of the church. Doesn't work that way. As Christians, you have to be a part of the church. And it's not only that you have to be a part of the church, but you should look at it not as an obligation, not as a burden, but as a privilege, as a blessing, that we get to be a part of the church. So I'm overjoyed, and I know that sometimes people make fun of me because my face doesn't always show that I'm overjoyed. But the reality is this: there's nothing that I look forward to more than anything else in the world than being together with the Lord's people. And during the week, when things have either gone extremely well or maybe they've gone extremely bad, I can always consistently count on the fact that I've got my family around me. So I hope and pray that as we think about Jesus and we think about his example that he led, that we'll all consider how much that we love and cherish and appreciate the church. If you're not a Christian, I'll just tell you, you're missing out. Truly, you're missing out on the greatest blessing of the world. That is that we have salvation through Jesus Christ. But the greatest blessing that is physically on this earth is that we get to be a part of his family. We get to celebrate the highs and lows together, and we get to walk through the bad days together, and we get to be victorious together when this place comes to an end. And if you've never obeyed the gospel and been added to the church by God, won't you do that tonight? But maybe you have been added to the church. Maybe you've kind of considered the church and kind of truly gotten uncomfortable or maybe even distasteful about the church, and maybe you need to mend some relationships with those in the church. Don't put that off. If you need to make something right that's gone awry in your life, we're here to serve you. If you need to obey the gospel, we would love to be a part of that. Or if you're here and you have prayer requests and we can help in any way, make it known as together we stand and sing.
Let's pray. Father, we come today with gratitude. Gratitude that we get to wake up another day and that you've given us life to hopefully serve you and glorify you in what we do, God. Thank you for giving us the ability to come here physically, to be able to make it here, but also to do this unharmed and unbothered. I thank you for the community that we have here, God, that we can love one another, be steadfast to one another, and to hold one another accountable. To those outside of the body, God, that may come in this building, help us to have never-ending compassion, but also be unwavering in truth, and help us to find the balance in that, and so that we can speak truth and love, God. Help us to bring that attitude here, but also as we go out from this place. We thank you for your Son, Jesus. In his name I pray. Amen.
John chapter 4. John chapter 4. There it goes. And we'll pick up in verse 21 here in just a minute. Tonight our topic is under things every Christian should know. We're going to talk about worship. And it is a broad and very wide-ranging topic, and I will remind you that what we're doing this quarter is summary level. Each one of these things could be talked about in extreme detail, but we're going to talk about worship tonight in the category of things that every Christian should know. You'll recognize from Dan's sermons not too long ago the story in John chapter 4 concerning the woman at the well. And I want to draw your attention, particularly beginning with verse 21, and I want you to notice how many times you see the word worship. We're going to key off of that. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth." Now there's a couple of words that are used most commonly in the New Testament for the word worship. The one that's used here and it's talked about so much, and I'll butcher the Greek pronunciation of it, but it's proskuneo, and it has the idea of coming before a king, bowing the knee, and offering a gift. That's the concept behind worship. And I want you to notice that in that there's some very specific things that make up New Testament worship and what Jesus is talking about. First of all, it is an intentional act. You don't accidentally worship. There's an intention that goes on in it. It's not all the time. It's at a specific time. You come with an intentional act to worship, and that's important to understand. It's always the lesser to the greater. So we are lowly servants coming before God and worshiping Him. So there's that particular aspect of the relationship of worship. Certainly we do this to express respect to God for all the things that He's given, especially the grace that He has given. And in that worship, we do, in fact, both in prayers and in songs, ask requests of our benefactor. Same idea of a servant bowing before a king. Now, when you come to the topic of worship, it's really important to have those elements in our mind. There has been over the years things that people confuse about this. You'll hear phrases like, all of life is worship, and that everything we do in life is worship. Now, in their defense, there's a little bit of support of that. You're familiar in Romans chapter 12. There's a phrase there about, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed to the renewing of your mind, and then offer your body as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And that word service has in it the idea of temple worship in it. And so some have gone there and have talked about that. That is a very different thing. You talk about living a godly life to give glory to God, absolutely. Absolutely, that's right. But generally, when the New Testament is talking about worship, and we're talking about worship tonight, we're talking about this idea of coming before the King at a specific time, in a specific way, to our benefactor, to someone who is greater than us, providing an offering. And that's really what we're talking about when we discuss worship. There's one other word that we may talk some more about. Don't confuse worship with edification. We edify one another. Worship is first to God and then to each other. Edification is to each other. And that's pretty important to kind of think about so that we don't get confused in things and as we think about what's authorized, etc. Now, in the New Testament, there are different kinds of worship that are talked about. When Paul was on Mars Hill, he talked about them worshiping the unknown God. That was not with truth. They didn't even know what they were worshiping, so they were worshiping the unknown God. Also involved in this idea of worshiping in spirit and in truth, think about when Jesus quoted Isaiah. He says, "In vain they do worship me, teaching the doctrines and commandments of men." Now, some have often pulled to that and started talking about unauthorized worship, and that's probably okay to use that. But what he was really talking about was, you can go back to the Sermon on the Mount, where the scribes and the Pharisees were teaching things that were doctrines of men and then trying to worship God. They were teaching it was okay if you wanted to divorce your wife, you just give her a certificate of divorce and send her out of the house. That was the doctrine of man. They were teaching you don't have to give and tithe. You can say it is, or take care of your parents. You can say it is Corbin, right? That's a doctrine of man. You can hate your enemy. That's a doctrine of man. And so there are many things that Jesus did that show that they were teaching the doctrines of men. And then he quotes Isaiah, and he says, "In vain you worship me. You think I'm the great benefactor. You say that. You come bow before me, but you teach all this stuff that's not mine." And that's why he says, "In vain they do worship me, teaching the doctrine and commandments of men." So when you come to thinking about the different acts of worship, we have to begin with something we talked about a few weeks ago, and it is this concept of authority. You can think about who's in charge when you come to the discussion of worship. You go, when Jesus first started talking about the church, Matthew 16, "Upon this rock I will build my church." There is an ownership there. There's a who's in charge that is there. When you have the biblical concept of worship, of coming and bowing before a king, it's the lesser to the greater. Who's in charge? He's in charge. And so we're to worship him the way that he wants us to worship. And that, again, involves what Jesus is talking about here, in spirit and in truth. Now let's talk about this concept of worshiping in spirit. And it's critical as we think about all 5 acts of worship. It is very easy for you and I to go through the routine. It is very easy for us to be here, to be at the show, to even engage in the show, and there's not a bit of worship that's going to my mind. That is very easy. It is a challenge. In fact, I think if we're all honest, there have been moments of time, perhaps too many moments of time, when worship was going on and we were physically there, but we were not in spirit there. And we all have to really work on that and recognize, the Jews in the old law, they're just carrying out some activities. But in the New Testament, it's about being in spirit. And so when I'm singing, when I'm being led in prayer, and all the other acts of worship, there's got to be an intentional mental participation in that, and we all have to work at it all the time. I think we're very careful to try to do things, we'll talk about it decently in order later, but try to do things that will allow for the greatest potential for all of us to engage in active, spirit-filled, heartfelt worship that we're engaged in. Of course, we talk about the Lord's Supper and the abuses that were there in 1 Corinthians 11, and talking about partaking in a worthy manner. By the way, that's not being worthy to partake. Don't ever confuse those two things. But partaking in a worthy manner, part of that is thinking about the death, burial, and resurrection. And to sit and to partake of the Lord's Supper and not to think about the death, burial, and resurrection is an abuse of the Lord's Supper. And that's not worshiping in spirit and in truth. I think we all know that. I think we all, including myself, always have to work on that to try to make that be what it should be. So that's the spirit element of that. The other element is truth. And I put truth in 2 categories here. And this even goes back to the conversation with the woman at the well. You can't worship God in truth when you have no intention of obeying Him. I mean, that's a falsehood. That's what the Pharisees were doing. And so to live a life that is opposite of what God wants, and then to come and think that you will have acceptable worship, is to deny the very concept of truth. In 1 Timothy 2, there's a discussion of lifting up holy hands in prayer. Now, there's lots of conversation that goes on about lifting holy hands. I understand all that, and won't spend a lot of time with it, but the emphasis there is on holy, not on the hands. Not really there's not much importance in the physical position that goes on in prayer. But the holy element of that is the same thing of truth. Really what it's calling about is people that are coming to pray, that are praying in a way where they got a true life that matches the fact that they're coming before their benefactor because they're being obedient to their benefactor. That's what it means to come with holy hands. You can come with bloody hands, or you can come with holy hands. And that's really what's being talked about, at least in my mind, in 1 Timothy chapter 2. All right, I want to spend a few minutes going through the 5 different acts of worship. But before I do that, any comments or thoughts on the preamble on worship? All right. First place, let's talk about the Lord's Supper. There's a lot of words that describe the Lord's Supper. Certainly it's a thanksgiving, or the fancy word for that is a Eucharist. It just means thanks. It is a supper, but it's the Lord's Supper. That is a possessive concept, right? So we're at a supper, but we're at the Lord's Supper, and that's intentional because we're part of that. It's a fellowship, breaking of bread. The idea of koine, which is the Greek word for fellowship, is there is a fellowship first with God and the Son, and then fellowship with each other. And sometimes we also lay across that the idea of communion. It's a memorial. It's remembering what's going on and what has happened. It's an anticipation of a banquet in heaven. There's a Lord's Supper concept there that reminds us of what heaven will be like as we sit around together at the Lord's table. There's a covenant meal, and covenant is critical. Covenant is this promise that God gives to us, and there's a meal that's involved in that is this idea of a continual remembering of the promise that's made, the promise of grace that God has given us. And certainly there's the sacrifice, and there's the concept of a mystery. New Testament talks about the mystery a lot. There's things we don't understand about the Lord's Supper and how all that works. And yet it's a key part of what we do. So attitudes when we're engaged in the Lord's Supper, certainly self-examination is a key one. Confession to God should always be part. It has a concept of reconciliation because it's through the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ that there is reconciliation and then peace. It could always be a time of rededication. If you're really thinking about what's been done for you and you think about that and then you think about our own lives and a rededication to try to be more sanctified, to be more holy in what we do every moment. And there's certainly joy that comes out of the Lord's Supper and part of the attitudes there. Acts 20 and verse 7, you probably know this, but this is the story when Paul is on a missionary journey. He's in a hurry to get back to Jerusalem. And even though he's in a hurry, he waits 6 days to meet with the brethren when they're going to come together. And it says they came together to break bread. The specific grammatical construction of that is sometimes called an infinitive of purpose. This is not a casual observation that they were having a meeting and they happened to break bread. The purpose, the reason that they came together was to break bread. And so Paul knew that on the Lord's Day, which was 6 days later, that's when they would come together, even though he was in a hurry. He was waiting for that so that for infinitive of purpose, the purpose that they came together was to break bread. From an authority perspective, this is one that people have wrestled with over the years. You ask the question, how often do you partake of the Lord's Supper. Well, what's the authority? Where is their authority? I would love there have been a declarative command that said each Sunday you partake of the Lord's Supper. We don't have that. But it doesn't say each month. It doesn't say each quarter. It doesn't say once a year. It doesn't say on Christmas and Easter. It doesn't say any of that. But we do have an approved apostolic example that's quite intentional where they came together on the first day of the week and for the purpose of partaking of the Lord's Supper. We also know they came together on every first day of the week, because we're going to get to giving later, 1 Corinthians 16, they came together on every first day of the week. And so if you're interested in the best understanding of the authority that's given, it's each Sunday partaking of the Lord's Supper. Any other option, you can't find any authority for it. There's nothing for it. There's zero authority in the New Testament for it, and that's why we do that. All right, comments on the Lord's Supper? Yeah. That's an interesting thought. I mean, I do think we ask for help in partaking in the Lord's Supper in the right way, because the command is to do that, and so it seems to me that that would be appropriate. I'm not sure that prayers for healing or prayers for the nation or anything like that is particularly appropriate during the time of the Lord's Supper. I don't know that I'd be... Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'd be dogmatic about it, but I don't know that that's really the time or the place for that, right? Yeah, that's a good point. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah, so. Right. Well, so we could go down a rabbit hole real fast on this, but I'll try to do this briefly. So, and the question was about images of Christ. You might also think about icons, crosses, and a statue of Christ or anything like that. So, one of the issues that we have as humans is we tend to want to have a thing to worship. Think about the calf that was, in the Mount Sinai when they're doing the Ten Commandments, and they made a golden image. The Protestant Reformation initially was recognized as, let's get rid of all those things. I could talk about the Nehushtan. Anybody know what a Nehushtan is? Snake on a stick, Nehushtan. So the snake that was on the stick in the wilderness stayed with the Israelites for centuries, and Hezekiah finally had to melt the thing down because they were treating it as an idol. And so you have those kinds of things that go on. So my judgment, I think elders need to decide, but my judgment is I would not put an image up there because it feeds the very problem that you have of people worshiping an image rather than spiritually worshiping God. Yeah. Yep. Right.
It's unique as near as I can tell. So it wasn't just a thing that God laid out. It was a singular, very unusual thing.
I think it's an excellent point. And again, I think it speaks to the potential of humanity to do the wrong thing with those images. So, yeah, thank you. All right. Yeah.
But you go to Africa, if we were to take the Lord's Supper how we do it here, I think we do it well, where
Yeah, no, I think, of course, a lot of those things are cultural that you're talking about. As a young person growing up where I grew up, the Lord's Supper was prayer, serve, we're out. That's what it was. And I at least appreciate the idea that we have some form, generally, of a mini sermonette that gets people in thinking about it and a lot of those kind of things. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I've been places where the Lord's Supper's 45 minutes. So.
When you put worship inside of a time frame or a box,
Yeah.
it's harder for me to bring myself to what I consider true worship.
Yeah.
I hate to see us put constraints on certain things, like how many songs, time frames. And I've been over here, that was a discussion, 5 minutes for a devotional on Wednesday night. We just create some difficult situations sometimes, and especially when we might want to look at somebody else and how they do it and think that's not right.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and like you're pointing out, these are a lot of cultural implications and all that. So. All right, let me. I'll briefly talk about prayer. We're all familiar with the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6. In our worship, there is as men are leading prayers, just some things to think about. There's an acronym called ACTS, Adoration, Confession, Thanksgiving, Supplication, as all being part of a proper prayer. You can certainly look at 1 Timothy chapter 2 and see that in there. In our worshiping in spirit and truth, whether you're leading or listening, you're engaging in that prayer, be sure you are. It is very easy for us to turn it off and our minds go somewhere else. Well, you're not worshiping when you're doing that. And so we need to really work on that. And I know that's hard. That's real life. But that's really important for us to remember. One little side comment that gets all kinds of debate on the Lord's Prayer. There's a phrase in there, thy kingdom come. And there are people that have very strong views about that. And I'm sympathetic to both sides of it. One side of it says, it's improper to pray thy kingdom come because his kingdom's already come. And that's right. His kingdom came on Pentecost. And so they want to deal with the false doctrine of the kingdom hasn't come yet and all that, and I get all that. But on the other hand, there's a lot of places, very local, that I would like the kingdom to come. Sometimes I'd like the kingdom to come to my house. Sometimes I'd like the kingdom to come to your house. Sometimes I'd like to have the kingdom come to the pew that's sitting beside me, right? So there's another sense in which you can pray that. Just be sure if you're thinking about that or ever using those words, you're understanding it in the right context. So that was for free. All right, let's talk about singing. We all know Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. Why don't you turn to Ephesians 5:19 for just a moment. We'll summarize just a few things here. Singing is a critical part of our worship. It gets debated and discussed a lot. Speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Those few words have had books and books and books written about them and all kinds of things around it. There's a few things that I want you to recognize about singing. First of all, it's communicative. It's speaking and teaching. Singing that is not teaching is not proper singing. By the way, and some of you will get this, unless you're Peter Frampton, you can't communicate with words with an instrument. Only a really small bunch if you got that, but that's okay. But singing is how you communicate with words. By the way, humming is not biblical worship, right? Because it's not communicating a message. That's a key part of what's going on. So it is communicating a message. It's upward first towards God. Outward to each other. We'll talk about that some more. It's collective. It's reflective, back and forth to each other. And it's reciprocal. One to 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 one, one to one. All those elements, and actually there's some reflexive and reciprocal pronouns that are in the verses if you want to get into the grammar about it that really demonstrate. That's really important because it tells you a variety of things. First of all, there's no participants. They're all participants. There's no spectators, right? There's no spectators in biblical singing. And we've got to understand that it is a participative thing that we do. And it's not unequal participation. Everyone should be equally engaged in it. We all know that we're priests. You know that in 1 Peter. In the Old Testament, there were priests that did the worship for them. Nobody's doing your worship for you. You're doing your worship because you're your own priest. And we all have to be equally engaged in that. By the way, that makes comments about a variety of things that have kind of come in over the years, whether it's choirs, whether it's solos, whether it's any of those kind of things. Those do not reflect the biblical concept of reciprocal and reflective equal participation, etc., one to another. There's all kinds of things that go on in our singing. There's preaching, there's confessing, there's the concept of spiritual sacrifice. We're engaged in sharing with the heavenly praise that the angels are doing. There's mutual edification one to another. Singing done well can bring the least feeling person, that's me, to emotional reaction because of everybody else being engaged in it. And that's a very, very big key. It's the unity of the church. It's everybody together. And as I said, deep religious emotion. Now, of course, we always have the conversation about instruments. We've been through this so much. It doesn't say you can't have instruments. No, it doesn't say that. This is the Luther versus Zwingli discussion that we talked about several weeks ago, which basically is you only do those things that are authorized. And then related to that is the law of silence. If one thing is stated, every equal corollary is excluded. There is a food that is stated for the Lord's Supper. It's the unleavened bread. Passover feast had lamb. Passover feast had bitter herbs, think pickles. Doesn't say you can't use those in the Lord's Supper. But we know we don't use those because we understand the concept of when one thing is provided, everything else is excluded. There are many kinds of music. There's vocal music, string music, percussion music, wind music, etc. There's only one kind of music that is specified in the New Testament, and that is vocal music. Kind of related to this, when my very early years of Haiti, I was conducting a preacher seminar, and we had some people that were coming from way out in the bush and coming in, and they didn't know a lot of things. And one country man very legitimately asked the question. He said, "Can we use drums in our worship?" And a number of the preachers there laughed at him. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" And I said, "You do the same thing." And they said, No. I said, "Oh, you don't?" I said, percussion music is banging two things together. You're hitting the drum. Then if I take two drumsticks and I bang them together, what do you have? And then if I take two blocks of wood and put them together, what do you have? And if I take away the blocks of wood, what do you have? That's percussion music right there. And so one of the key things I pointed out, because they clapped while they were singing, and one of the things I pointed out is percussion music is unauthorized in the singing that we have going on. So it's important to recognize that and understand it. There's all kinds of things that go on. There's harps in heaven. Yes, of course there are harps in heaven. But in the New Testament church, there were not instruments of music in the church. They followed the synagogue model of worship. The word a cappella, you've heard this. It's Latin, means in the manner of the church. It was 6 centuries before there was the first instrument at all in the church. And we can go through all these things. There's arguments about the word solo, which is the pluck, but the instrument that's plucked is the heart. So all kinds of things that can be discussed. Questions you have about singing that you want to talk about? Yeah. Yeah.
There are churches that have that up there that is equal to the Bible, and I'm just wondering how you answer that.
Yeah, I mean, could go a little bit to doing things decently in order to the best of your ability, right? There are people that literally cannot sing on key, but they still need to sing, and that's good, and that's wonderful. And I think that's something that needs to be recognized. We do get very focused on the mechanics of the music. That's fine, but I'd be a whole lot more interested in we actually knew what the words were we were singing and we knew what they meant. Here I raise my Ebenezer. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you know what that means, but you sing that. Or Night with Ebon Opinion. We sing that. Do you actually know what that means? And so I'm more interested in the communicative part of the singing going the way that it should. And the number of amazing song leaders we have here just stuns me. I mean, we got pros here, high pros, which is wonderful. I'm glad we have them. That's great. But I'm more interested in you knowing what the words mean and what that they speak to your heart and you speak to my heart while we're singing. Based on their singing? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. See, that means you're wanting to be a spectator. And we're not wanting to be spectators. We are participants. I need to go where I can participate. Yeah. Then the truth. Yeah, truth first. Yeah. 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 I always say the heart should follow the head. Get the head right first, and then the emotions will come properly. Otherwise, you don't know if you have the right truth. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. You get experience at looking at those websites, though. You can figure them out. You can figure them out pretty quick. Yeah.
I visited 13 churches in one form or fashion, and I went to worship the Great Oak, which I did. But because of the snow, Memphis is worse than Nashville when it comes to snow. I mean, I could hardly find a place to eat Saturday night. But I went into one of the larger congregations, and I heard singing through the microphones, and there weren't too many people there. And I sat down, and I truly was going there to worship because I thought they else wasn't going to worship. And I found out they were rehearsing.
Yeah. Yeah. Praise team kind of thing.
Well, I don't know what it was. I left.
Yeah.
I asked somebody, I said, "You have to worship today or what?" They said, "Yeah, they're rehearsing."
Yeah.
So I gave them information to them.
Well, and I think having singing practice and some of those kinds of things are good things, but when it gets to a performance oriented, that's when you start having the problems. All right, I've got 6 minutes to talk about giving. Good luck with that, right? So we've got giving. What the word that I would always say that is the New Testament concept is the one of sacrificial giving. When you read in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, what you're so impressed with is that they gave more than they were able. It's the sacrificial giving concept. And you've got all the ideas of the seed sowing, etc. That's from a biblical perspective. Here's what I always tell people, and I tell myself: you should live a lifestyle that is below what you would be living if you didn't give. Now, that doesn't mean everybody lives the same lifestyle. That's not what that says. You should be living a lifestyle that's below what you could be able. And I was kind of explaining this. There were some students at Freed Hardeman. They were done. No, what do you mean? I said, well, if you can, own a Toyota Avalon, buy a Camry, right? if you can own a Lexus, own a Toyota Avalon, right? If you can own a Mercedes, whatever, and just work your way up, but whatever. But the point is that it's less than you would. We should feel sacrificial giving. And so long as we feel sacrificial giving, that's an important marker. But there's all kinds of things that go on in the sacrificial giving. There's obviously the recognition of the grace. I made some comments not too long ago about, we separate the Lord's Supper and the giving as acts of worship. Yes, we should. But we shouldn't be separating them in mind, because part of our giving should be taking into consideration the grace that God has given to us. And so that's a component of what goes on there. There's certainly the concept of the ministry and the evangelism, et cetera, that goes on. It's really a proof. It's a test of who we are and whether we, in fact, are worshiping God in truth. So much could be said about that. One thing I would just briefly note, this is a category of things you should know. There have been over the years debates about how the treasury can be used. If you're old enough, you know this topic. I already knew about it, but when I moved here, the Church of Christ that is closest to my house, it's called the Brentwood Church of Christ. Now, I didn't go in there. I didn't need to, because I already knew that the guy was a graduate of Florida Bible College, so I knew what that meant. But it's what's called a non-institutional, and so there's this debate about how you can use church funds and whether you can use it for parachurch organizations and to help people that are not Christians. There are all kinds of debates about this in the 50s. You can go research some of this if you want. But it's a topic that you ought to know just a little bit about. What I would always say is that when Paul went to Macedonia, he went to multiple churches, pooled funds from multiple churches. That's what a para organization does, and then distributed. And so if you ever hear the phrase anti or non-institutional, that's what that particular debate is about. Yeah. Yeah.
I had an uncle who was an elder there, wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Good people.
And until I came here, I never heard from my dad a negative term about
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But I hear it on the road, and I would just encourage people. And it's a much bigger situation outside the state. Be careful how you use that term.
It's better to use non-institutional as a description. I think that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
We worshiped it over our marriage we attended, visited several non-institutional practices. But one thing I've come to the understanding is that I can fellowship those people just fine.
That's right.
But they have a problem fellowship.
Which is the way it goes from along the spectrum, right? That's the way it always goes. And by the way, there's a whole set of studies that can go into on all that, and they're absolutely sincere in their views about it. I don't think that's a concern at all. But yeah, they think you're doing things that are wrong, so that's the reason that you have that fellowship problem. All right. I didn't spend much time at all on preaching, but obviously that is the fifth act of worship. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And Hosea said that. And if there's anything that we ought to always be involved in, and we do a good job of that here when we're together, is knowing the Word. Knowing the Word, getting into our minds, and then knowing how to apply it. And, of course, our preaching is foremost where that needs to happen. I'll mention briefly as we close 1 Corinthians 14:40, doing things decently and in order. There is a reason that that's there. That is a chapter that is all about a whole bunch of abuses in worship. And the last thing that Paul leaves them with is doing things decently and in order. There may be things that, could jazz things up or make them more sporadic. And I actually think that's what was going on in 1 Corinthians 14. Decently in order. Yeah, I know we don't have to have, 2 songs of prayer, a song of the Lord. I know we don't have to do that. But at least that's in order, right? There's decency and in order. And as we think about how we worship and what we do, that has to be a key component of what we're doing and carrying out. All right, I threw a lot at you. I mean, we could spend an entire quarter on this, but any questions before we go? All right, appreciate your attention. Thank you.